My family owns a cozy little cabin tucked away in the snowy mountains of Vermont. It's the kind of place that feels like a world apart, especially in winter when the landscape transforms into a serene, white wilderness. My parents, both passionate hikers, were drawn to the area's natural beauty and bought the property long before I was even born. The cabin, with its rustic charm and creaky floors, is a part of my earliest memories. At nearly 45 years old, it shows its age, with peeling paint and a wood stove that's more temperamental than reliable. My dad often spent weekends fixing things, from patching the roof to replacing drafty windows. He'd talk about tearing it down one day to build something modern. But for me, the charm of its imperfections made it feel like home. This story happened about 18 years ago when I was just 9, and my older brother, Ethan, was 12. It was the kind of childhood memory that leaves an imprint, not just because of what we experienced, but because of how deeply it shook us. We were visiting Vermont during the peak of winter, and a fierce snowstorm had swept through the area. The snow piled high, blanketing everything in sight. For two adventurous kids, it was a playground like no other. We couldn't resist heading outside to explore the snowy expanse that surrounded our cabin. The best part about the property was its vast, open space, bordered by dense woods on all sides. A narrow, dead-end road sloped downhill from our cabin, leading to a cluster of similarly secluded homes. The woods, with their towering pines and skeletal birches, created a labyrinth perfect for games like hide and seek. We'd spent countless winters turning the snow-covered landscape into a battleground for snowball fights and fort building. But this particular day, we decided to play a new game, one Ethan had come up with the night before as the storm raged outside. The rules were simple yet thrilling in their own way. Each of us would claim a spot to build a snow fort and hide a treasure, a large, perfectly round snowball. The objective was to sneak into the other's fort, steal their treasure, and bring it back to your own base without getting caught. The idea was pure genius to our young minds, and the snowstorm's aftermath provided the perfect setting for our game. Ethan, always the strategist, chose his spot first. He picked a secluded corner on the neighboring property, an empty vacation home that was rarely occupied. We often played there since the owners hardly ever visited in the winter. The place had a certain eerie stillness to it, with its snow-covered roof and darkened windows. But to us, it was just another part of our playground. "I'm setting up here," Ethan declared, brushing snow off his gloves. "You'll never find my treasure." His grin was infectious, and I couldn't help but laugh. I chose a spot closer to our cabin, a small clearing near the edge of the woods. The trees around it provided excellent cover, their branches heavy with fresh snow. The air was crisp, and the only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Ethan ran down the road to his chosen area, disappearing into the swirling snowflakes. He had a small whistle, which he planned to blow when he was ready to start the game. I crouched in my spot, meticulously shaping my treasure snowball. It had to be perfect, smooth, round, and just the right size to carry back without slowing me down. The anticipation was almost unbearable as I waited for the whistle's shrill call to signal the beginning of our adventure. Finally, the sound pierced through the stillness, sharp and clear. It was time. I darted out from behind my fort, keeping low to the ground as I scanned the area for any sign of Ethan. The snow muffled most sounds, making it hard to gauge where he might be. The world felt bigger somehow, the vast expanse of white stretching endlessly in every direction. My heart pounded with excitement as I carefully made my way toward his fort, every step a calculated move to avoid detection. When I reached the edge of the neighboring property, I paused, crouching behind a tree. From my vantage point, I could see the outline of Ethan's fort. It was impressive, a carefully crafted barricade of snow that blended seamlessly with the surrounding landscape. But Ethan was nowhere in sight. I grinned, thinking I had the upper hand. Slowly, I crept closer, my breath visible in the icy air. Just as I was about to make my move, something caught my attention, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I froze, my gaze snapping toward the woods beyond Ethan's fort. At first, I thought it was him, hiding in the shadows, waiting to ambush me. But as I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, a strange feeling washed over me. There, among the trees, was a figure. It wasn't Ethan. It was taller, its silhouette blurred by the falling snow. It stood perfectly still, partially obscured by a thick pine tree. My chest tightened, the thrill of the game replaced by an inexplicable sense of unease. "Ethan?" I called softly, my voice barely above a whisper. But the figure didn't move. It didn't respond. My fingers dug into the snow as I crouched lower, trying to stay hidden. The cold seemed sharper now, the silence heavier. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining it, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But then it moved. A slow, deliberate shift, as if it knew I was watching. I scrambled backward, my heart racing. "Ethan!" I called louder this time, panic creeping into my voice. The figure remained motionless, its presence looming like a shadow in the distance. The whistle sounded again, but this time it didn't feel playful. Felt urgent, like a warning. Abandoning the game entirely, I turned and ran back toward the cabin, the snow crunching loudly beneath my boots. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't dare. Whatever I had seen, I knew it wasn't part of the game. I waited and waited. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one more agonizing than the last. My breath hung in the freezing air, visible in faint clouds as the snowstorm continued to rage. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The whistle never came. A knot of unease tightened in my stomach, but I told myself Ethan was probably just testing my patience, trying to lure me into letting my guard down. Still, the eerie stillness around me began to gnaw at my nerves. Assuming the sound of the whistle had been muffled by the storm, I decided to venture out. The woods looked darker and more menacing now, their once familiar shapes blurred by the relentless snowfall. The road seemed like the safer option, so I set off, my boots crunching loudly through the knee-deep snow. Each step felt heavier than the last, the icy wind biting at my exposed face as I pulled my scarf tighter. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the neighboring property. The faint outline of Ethan's fort came into view through the trees. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The fort was intact, untouched, yet Ethan was nowhere to be seen. I hesitated, scanning the area for any sign of movement. The swirling snow made it hard to focus, but something about the scene felt wrong. It was too quiet, too still. I cautiously stepped onto the property, my heart pounding with each step. The snow was pristine, except for a faint trail of footprints leading from the fort toward the house. I approached the fort, my eyes darting between the trees and the darkened windows of the neighbor's home. As I reached out to grab the treasure, a voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Are you looking for your brother?" I froze, spinning around to see an older woman standing on the porch of the neighbor's house. She was bundled in a thick coat, her gloved hands resting lightly on the porch railing. Her voice had a strange quality to it, soft, almost sweet, but laced with something I couldn't quite place. "We're just playing a game," I called back, trying to sound confident. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "He's not here," she said, her tone calm but unsettling. The words sent a shiver down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. Something about her felt off. I took a hesitant step closer, trying to get a better look at her face. The storm made it difficult, but as I approached, her features became clearer. Her skin was pale, almost ghostly, and deep lines etched her face, making her seem far older than her posture suggested. But it was her smile that truly unnerved me. A wide, unnatural grin that didn't reach her eyes. My pulse quickened, and I felt a strange, primal urge to back away. As I stood there, torn between retreating and confronting her, something caught my eye. Through an upstairs window, partially obscured by the falling snow, I saw a face. It was faint, almost a shadow against the frosted glass, but it was unmistakable. Someone was watching me. They wore a dark hat, their features blurred, but their gaze felt piercing. For a fleeting moment I thought it might be Ethan, but something about the figure was wrong. It was too still, too deliberate, like a photograph come to life. "Come in and warm up," the woman said suddenly, her voice pulling me back to the present. She waved me toward the house, her grin unwavering. "No, I'm fine," I replied, my voice shaky. My eyes darted back to the window, but the figure was gone. A knot of fear tightened in my chest as I glanced at the snow around me. A second trail of footprints, different from mine and Ethan's, led from the fort to the front door and then back toward the woods. The sight made my stomach drop. Who else had been here? The woman's voice grew more insistent. "You'll freeze out here. Come inside." Her words were friendly enough, but there was an undercurrent of urgency that made my skin crawl. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt rooted in place. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, warning me that something wasn't right. I took a step back, my eyes flicking between her and the woods. The snow fell harder now, the storm thickening, but I could still see the faint trail of footprints leading into the trees. My heart hammered in my chest as I weighed my options. The warmth of the house was tempting, but every fiber of my being told me it was a trap. "I need to find my brother," I said, my voice firm despite the tremor in my hands. Without waiting for a response, I turned and bolted toward the woods, following the second trail of footprints. The snow clung to my boots, making every step a struggle, but adrenaline pushed me forward. The storm swallowed the sound of my escape, leaving only the eerie quiet of the forest. As I ran, I felt eyes on me. The sensation was suffocating, as if the figure from the window was watching my every move. I didn't dare look back. The trees closed in around me, their branches heavy with snow, casting long shadows that danced in the dim light. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one visible in the freezing air. Finally, I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree. My ears strained for any sound. A crunch of snow, a distant voice, but there was nothing. The silence was deafening, pressing down on me like a weight. I glanced around, my eyes darting between the shadows, searching for any sign of movement. The trail of footprints continued deeper into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. For a moment, I considered turning back, retreating to the safety of the cabin. But the thought of leaving Ethan out here, alone, was unbearable. Steeling myself, I pushed forward, the fear in my chest battling against the determination to find my brother. Whatever was waiting for me in the woods, I had no choice but to face it. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from my chest. The sound of heavy footsteps upstairs sent a jolt of terror through me, and my voice cracked as I screamed, "Ethan!" The woman's unsettling smile vanished, replaced by a cold, piercing stare. Her expression alone was enough to make my blood run cold, but it was the footsteps that pushed me over the edge. Panic surged through me as I turned and bolted, retracing my steps through the snow. The storm had intensified, the wind whipping snowflakes against my face, but I didn't stop. Behind me, the woman shouted something, her voice high-pitched and frantic, but her words were drowned out by the roaring wind and my own fear. I didn't dare look back. The forest seemed endless, each tree a dark silhouette against the swirling white storm. My legs ached, and my lungs burned with every breath, but the fear of whatever was in that house kept me moving. My only thought was to get back to the cabin, to safety, to my family. As I neared the clearing, a sharp, familiar sound pierced the chaos. My dad's whistle. Relief flooded over me like a tidal wave, and my legs carried me the rest of the way with renewed strength. When I burst into the driveway, the sight of my dad and Ethan standing there stopped me in my tracks. My dad was holding a flashlight, its beam cutting through the snowy darkness, and Ethan was beside him, looking pale and shaken. I stumbled toward them, tears streaming down my face, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Where were you?" my dad demanded, his tone sharp with worry. Before I could answer, Ethan blurted out, "I was on the road when they tried to get me to come inside that house." His voice was trembling, and his words came out in a rush. "I didn't go in. I ran back here." My dad's expression darkened. He didn't say anything for a moment, but I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his grip tightened on the flashlight. "Stay here with your mom," he finally said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Without another word, He turned and headed down the driveway toward the neighbor's property, his flashlight bobbing as he disappeared into the snowy night. Ethan and I stood there, shivering and silent. My mom came out, pulling us both inside the cabin and wrapping us in blankets. Her worry was palpable as she fussed over us, asking questions neither of us could fully answer. The storm raged on outside, and every creak of the cabin's old wooden frame made me jump. I kept glancing out the window, half expecting to see the woman's eerie smile or the shadowy figure from the upstairs window. Felt like hours before my dad returned. When he finally stepped through the door, his face was flushed from the cold, and his boots were caked with snow. He shook his head as he set the flashlight on the counter. The house was locked up, he said, his voice tight. No one answered when I knocked. I went to the next property over, and they called the owners. Ethan and I exchanged a glance. What did they say? I asked hesitantly. My dad hesitated, his eyes narrowing as if trying to piece together his own thoughts. They weren't in town this weekend, he said slowly. No one was supposed to be there. His words sent a chill down my spine. The unease that had been simmering inside me boiled over into full-blown fear. My mind raced with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. If the owners weren't there, then who was? And why were they trying to lure us inside? The police were called shortly after. 2 officers arrived at the cabin, their squad cars flashing lights barely visible through the snowstorm. They took our statements, asking us to describe the woman and the strange figure I'd seen in the upstairs window. I tried to explain everything as clearly as I could, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. The officers assured us they'd investigate, and my dad accompanied them back to the neighboring house. Ethan and I stayed behind with our mom, the 3 of us huddled together in the living room. The hours dragged on, each minute punctuated by the howling wind outside and the occasional crackle of the wood stove. When my dad returned, he looked more troubled than ever. The back door was unlocked, he said quietly. The police searched the house, but they didn't find anyone inside. Nothing seemed out of place. He paused, his gaze fixed on the floor. They're going to keep an eye on the area, but there's not much else they can do right now. In the days that followed, my parents took precautions. They brought home any valuable items we'd left at the cabin, worried that whoever had been in the neighbor's house might try to break in. Ethan and I weren't allowed to wander far from the cabin anymore, and the thought of going near the neighboring property filled me with dread. The once magical snow-covered landscape now felt sinister, its beauty tainted by the memory of that night. Even now, years later, the events of that winter haunt me. I often think about the woman's unsettling smile, the footsteps upstairs, and the figure in the window. Who were they? What did they want? And what would have happened if Ethan or I had stepped inside that house? I'll never know the answers, and maybe that's for the best. But one thing is certain, that night changed the way I see the world. The cabin, once a sanctuary of adventure and wonder, became a reminder that even the most familiar places can hide dark secrets.